So with GenCon starting today and there being way too many games to check out, I decided to sift through the entire interwebs and discover all the games that I think are worth previewing. I didn't aim for any number of games, I just picked out all the ones that I thought looked really cool, and there's a lot. I'll be at GenCon, you'll be at GenCon, and if you're not, I'll pretend you're at GenCon. And I would love for us to play any one of these games. Some of these games I have played before and other ones I haven't, but I didn't want to limit this list on one or the other, and I've arranged them from my least to most interested based on what I know from either playing them or doing research or reading through the rules already, or in some other cases, what I hope the game to be. But of course, to actually make this list at all, each one of these games needs to be interesting enough that I'm willing to spend some of my limited time at GenCon learning and playing these games. But we got a lot of games covered. I'm going to try to go through this quickly, so let's check them out. And let's be honest, there's never too many games. And my least interested game that I'm interested in playing at GenCon is Happy Home, and this one is a competitive tile drafting and tile placement game. And I'll be honest, the big pull on this one for me is mostly the theme. That's why it's my least interesting game. And the gameplay on this one does remind me of games like Patchwork, where you're going to have a circle of different tiles that players are going to be drafting, and it's whoever is furthest back that's going to be able to move up as far as they want in order to get that tile. Each player is going to have a board representing their house, and each of the tiles are going to have different placement rules as well as different locations where they are allowed to be placed within your house. Looks like a fine game, but there's nothing too innovative with this one really standing out to me. I wish there was more. And honestly, I probably wouldn't even be mentioning this one if it wasn't for the theme and the fact that I know my girlfriend would probably love this one. Next up, we have Arcs, and if you're wondering why this is so low on my list after all the hype it got from being on Shut Up and Sit Down, well, the reason for that is that I do think this probably is an excellent game if you're willing and able to sink a ton of time into this one, and if you also have a game group that's dedicated enough to consistently play this one, and also everyone at the table actually likes it. I am really interested in this game, but the fact of the matter is that this game is going to be asking a lot from your game group. I really wanted to call this one out because even though I do admire and respect Shut Up and Sit Down and all the work that they do, and they're one of my favorite board game channels, I still do think that just because they like it a lot, it doesn't mean that you'll like it a lot. This is coming from a group of people where it's their livelihood to play games, so they have the time to sink into this. I don't think I do, and I also just wanted this one to be a little bit of a warning that if you are thinking about going out and buying this one, that's perfectly fine, but GenCon is a great opportunity to try it before you do. I was really excited when I originally heard that the campaign for this one was only 3 games. I thought this was going to be much more accessible than their previously released games, and if you do want to hear me gush about it and say a lot of nice things, you can definitely go ahead and check out my previous video where I go into how this game plays and I dig into all the little details. And I guess I haven't really said anything about how the actual game plays, but this is a 4X legacy game where players are going to be using a trick-taking mechanism in order to perform their actions on each of the rounds. And that's all I'm going to say about this one in this video, but if you do want to check it out, you can go ahead and check out my previously released video. Or of course, you could just go ahead and check out the couple videos that were uploaded by Shut Up and Sit Down. Just keep in mind that they do really love this game. And the next game is actually one that I have played, and I do recommend trying this one out. It's pretty quick to play, and it's called Let's Go to Japan. And this one is a competitive game where each player is going to be drafting different cards and trying to create an itinerary of what they plan to do for their trip to Japan. This involves a bunch of different activities and experiences between Kyoto and Tokyo, and players are going to be putting cards into each of the different days in their week, with each card contributing some amount of icons, but it's the last card you place that determines how that row is going to score. A really fun game here with a really fun theme. Definitely try it if you do get the chance. And the next game that I'm interested in is called Captain Flip, and I'm sure you probably heard about this one by now because it was nominated for Spiel des Jahres. It didn't actually win, but it still does look like a really fun game. It's light enough that I think you could play this with almost anyone, and I think it still does offer some fun choices for the gamers as well. The way this game works is that each player is going to have their own ship, and you're going to be drawing tiles and then placing them in the different columns on your ship, always placing them from the bottom upward. But when you draw the tile, you can only look at the side of the tile that's facing you, and you have to decide whether or not you want to place that tile. And if you think the character you see on that side of the tile isn't very useful to you, you do have the option to flip it to the other side. But once you do that, you can't ever flip it back, so there is a bit of a push your luck element, and you're going to be stuck with whatever is on the opposite side of that tile. That being said, the monkey does allow you to flip an already placed tile, so if you do get that, you can flip it back. A really simple game here, but I think a lot of thought went into it, and I think that's the reason that it's done so well so far. And the next most interesting game to me is Dying Light, the board game, and this one is based on the video game with the same name. And this is a cooperative game where players are trying to play through a few different scenarios and trying to complete those objectives in order to win the game. But what makes this one really cool is, well, a couple things. First of all, the game's going to be alternating between night and day, and during the night phase, all the zombies get a lot more aggressive and a lot more difficult, and I just think that's a really fun aspect to the game. And the publisher here really doubled down on it because this whole game is actually designed to glow in the dark if you play it under a UV light. And if you're playing this at my house, I definitely play this game under normal lighting conditions until you get to the night phase, and then flick all the lights off and turn on that UV light so you can enjoy the game in all its horror. The gameplay for this one looks like a lot of fun as well, with a whole momentum mechanism. Definitely recommend checking out, and that's why it's one that I'm interested in. The next one is also based on a video game with the same name, and this one is Apex Legends, and I am just a huge fan of this franchise. I think the designers on this one did a great job transitioning the different mechanisms that make Apex Legends unique and incorporating all that into the actual board game. Just like in the video game, all the characters work very, very different from each other, and there's a whole bunch of different weapons that you can equip with all sorts of different hop-ups and upgrades. And the game does also feature a unique accuracy mechanism that I haven't seen in any other game. I am really interested in it, although also somewhat skeptical, but nonetheless, I am still interested. And next we have Fromage, which is a competitive worker placement game, but what makes this one so unique is that it actually features a rotating board in the middle of the table, and it's not just for show because it does facilitate a few of the mechanisms that this game has to offer. First of all, each of the 4 parts of the board are a different minigame that you're going to be scoring victory points in a different way. This means that when a section's rotated towards you, that's the one that you're currently going to be engaged with. It's all about making cheese here, so no matter which one you're dealing with, you're going to be putting cheese out on the board, and they're going to be putting your workers on any of your cheeses. And this is where the rotating board comes into play again, because your worker stays out on the board until that board gets rotated enough that it's facing back towards you. I think there's some really cool ideas here, and I did almost buy this one myself, but the reason that I didn't end up pulling the trigger on this one is just because I didn't feel like there was enough interaction between the different segments of the board. I was a little concerned that it would just feel like you're playing 4 different mini-games and that your decisions on one segment would have no impact on any of the others. And I just would have liked some sort of chaining effect or something to intertwine the different segments together, and I just didn't see that in the campaign. Maybe they'll release an expansion for this in the future with some different boards that add something like that, and if that's the case, I probably will jump in on this one. But I am still very interested in it and would love to try it at GenCon. I could be surprised and like it a lot more than I think. And next we have Avalon the Riven Vale, which is an Arthurian area control game, and what makes this one so interesting is that it is coming from the same studio that brought you the game Oathsworn, which is a game that a ton of people like, and I also like. I've played through a few of the chapters. I do like the gameplay and I do like the story, but I do find that there's a little bit too much randomness with the decisions, and that doesn't really give you enough clues as to where to look, and you just kind of poke and prod and hope that you made the right decision. It's a common issue that I see with campaign games, so I'm going to call it out when I see it. This one is not a campaign game as far as I can tell, and I think this team knows exactly what they're doing when it comes to putting together a really great game, as we have seen with Oathsworn. There's not really much more info out on this one right now, which just makes it showing up at GenCon that much more intriguing. So if you do have a chance to check this one out, definitely take it and let me know how it is. And the next one I'm interested in is a bit of a smaller one, and this one is just a card game, but it is designed by Mary Flanagan that I think has done a great job with her previous designs. Phantom Ink is amazing, Mechanica is amazing. I haven't really played much of the others, but I do have hope, and I think this one does look like a lot of fun. This is a game where players all start with 10 cards, but then you're going to be drawing 7 each round, and then you're going to be trying to match cards together in a row so that each card either matches the previous color or the previous number that was played before it. Also, you'll be earning victory points every time you make a chain of at least 6 cards, with each additional card adding even more victory points to that total. Things even get more interesting once you consider the different special abilities that each of the cards grant you when you play them. I think this one will pack a punch in a little package, and that's why I recommend checking this one out. And this next one is one that I'm definitely interested in, but also somewhat skeptical because I know my interest is somewhat based on the hype that this one's been getting lately. And this is, of course, Windmill Valley, where players are going to have these different rotating gears where you're going to be able to slot in different actions. They're going to be rotating your gears according to a water level in order to dictate which actions you'll have access to. I think everything about this game does look pretty fun, although some parts of the game do seem a little bit bland, like the whole water level mechanism. It doesn't really seem like a super fun action, and I wish they did that in a different way, but who knows, maybe this is another one that'll surprise me. I'll definitely be trying to play it if I do get the chance. And this next one also uses rotating gears, and I kept this one notch above Windmill Valley because I think I would have been more interested in this one if Windmill Valley didn't get the hype that it got. And this one does share some elements with Windmill Valley. You're going to have a bunch of gears that you're going to be rotating each and every round. And you can also put different tokens into the gears in order to change the sort of resources or actions that they grant you. And you can also put tokens into the center of the gears as well in order to further augment those actions. The way this works is that whichever icons are at the bottom of each of the different gears when it's your turn to produce, you're going to be gaining the action or resource of whatever is depicted on that particular side. This is going to allow you to generate all sorts of resources that you'll need for other actions in the game, but it also does create waste, and players are going to have to manage that if they want to maintain alliances with the different factions and potentially gain access to those factions' special abilities. Not quite as pretty as Windmill Valley, but I think this one has more of a focus on the gear mechanism itself and doesn't have a whole lot else to distract you from it. And I don't have any complaints with the actions in this one. I really like how when you perform an action, it also gives a smaller action to everyone else at the table, so everyone's constantly engaged. Definitely worth checking out, and that is Sprocketforge. And this next one probably shouldn't be so high on the rotating gears list because I really don't know anything about this one other than it's from Elf Creek Games, which I'm glad to see is still around. But the reason that I kept this one above Sprocketforge and also above Windmill Valley is basically hope. I really like the theme on this. I'm a big fan of watches. I do pretend to be a collector, and I would have a lot more if they weren't so dang expensive. But this is another game that does use gears, and it uses the passage of time to facilitate the different mechanisms in the game. I don't really know much more about it, but Elf Creek Games has done fantastic work in the past, and I hope they do just as good of work with this one because I love the theme, and I'd love to find another gear-based game that I like as much as Tolkien, but maybe is a little bit easier to get to the table. And next we have Galactic Renaissance, which is a game that got a lot of attention back when it was announced, but I haven't heard too much about it since then, but I think this is a game that did live up to the hype. But this is an area control game that has no combat at all. It has a bit of deck building, and players are going to be using the actions on their cards, chaining them together and using multiple cards on a single turn in order to perform a whole variety of actions. The whole goal here is to try and gain the most influence on each of the different planets so that you control that planet, because that's going to be earning you victory points at the end of the game, but each of the planets has a limited amount of spaces that planet will allow. The thing is, you can still put more units than spaces on a planet, but when that happens, the planet falls into disorder, and then each player who has a unit on that planet has a choice to either take 2 units away or sacrifice one of their units from that planet permanently for the rest of the game in order to keep all their other units still on that planet. That might sound crazy, but that's a really good way to keep more units on that planet than your opponents so that you are still in control of it. Looks like a really fun game, and I'd love to try this one out. And the next game I'm interested in is Innovation Ultimate, which is another BGG page that has almost no pictures on it, so I'm going to be pulling up the original Innovation. Keep in mind the new version might look a little bit different than the old one, but this is a card game where you're going to have a bunch of different eras around a table with a bunch of cards in the center of the table. Players are going to be starting with a few cards from the first era, and each card that you get is going to be in a particular color, which is going to determine which column you're going to be putting that card into in front of you in your own tableau. But whichever card is on the top of that stack is going to be the special ability that you have access to. That being said, the cards behind it can still augment its power. But the whole goal of this game is to try and gain influence, because if you're able to gain 5 times the amount of influence as any one of these eras, you'll be able to cash that in to dominate that specific era. Players can only draw cards from particular decks depending on the value of the cards that they have in their tableau, which means that players are going to be racing to try and get a certain amount of influence, while also trying to get to the more powerful cards in the later eras. I'm always fascinated to find simple games that offer quite a lot of depth, and I think this one does, and that's why it is so high in my list of games. Next on my list we have Harvest, which looks like a fun little farm game that incorporates its theme in a really cute way with the artwork here, where players are going to be playing as various animals. But what's really neat about this game is that every round players are going to be bidding on different cards that are going to be determining their turn order in the worker placement, but they're also going to be determining what resources they get depending on what's depicted on those cards. Players actually start with a hand of these cards, and in order to get first dibs on any of those cards out on the table, you actually have to play one of those cards from your hand in order to get priority to draft one of the other cards. And I know I said cards, but it looks like the game actually uses tiles, not cards. But this whole mechanism creates a neat little loop where you're putting in tiles in order to draft other tiles, but then the tiles that you put in then become available for the other players in the future. This is a game that I've been chasing around for a while now. I've already seen it at a few conventions, but every time I try to play it, someone's already swiped it, so hopefully I can get it to the table this time around. I guess we'll see. I think the games are getting pretty good now, but we still got quite a few to go through, so there's lots to be excited about. But the next one is Robinson Crusoe, and this one is the Portal version of the game. And this is a game that I was originally very interested in when the campaign launched, but Awakened Realms also had their hand in this one, and although I do think Awakened Realms does fantastic work most of the time, they also have a bad habit of just putting miniatures where they don't belong. And this was one of the worst cases of that happening. But essentially, this is a worker placement game where you have stackable workers that you can put out in different locations out on the board. And they decided to replace those stackable tokens with miniatures that aren't stackable. And then they had to dial that back by adding a disc in order to indicate that a miniature was stacked. The problem with that is that you still don't know which other miniature that stacked miniature is supposed to be stacked on top of, because that information also matters, which means that you need to strategically place your miniatures together in order to indicate that, which, isn't a hugely difficult thing to do. But this is just another case of miniatures just making an already fairly complex game even more fiddly. I like miniatures when they complement a game, not when they make a game even more difficult to play. But aside from all that, I love the theme of this one, and this is also a really hard game, and it's also a survival game, and all of those things I absolutely love. This game's been through the test of time, and it offers all sorts of different scenarios for you to play through that all play very differently from each other. You can play one scenario in this game, and then play another one, and it can almost feel like a different game. I think the new campaign in the Book of Adventures added a bunch of really cool concepts and scenarios into the game as well, and I'm really excited to try those out. This is one of the few campaigns that I didn't back that I do have a little bit of FOMO about. I definitely would have if they had a pledge that allowed me to get everything else in the game except for those miniatures, but unfortunately those miniatures were bundled in with almost every other important stretch goal that you do want as part of this game. And I just wasn't willing to spend that much money on all that extra plastic, the extra shipping, and to take up the extra space on my shelf. I haven't really heard too much about this one since the campaign ended, but it looks like they are still wrapping up the shipping here. So I am really interested to hear from anyone that has got their game, and if my concerns with the miniatures are even valid. Maybe I'm missing something here, but the game still can be played without the miniatures, so that is always still an option. Like I said, the game itself does look amazing, and it stood the test of time, and that's why it is so high up in my list. Next we have Kelp Shark vs. Octopus, which is a two-player game where one player is playing as a shark and one player is playing as an octopus. Of course, each of these work very different from each other, with the shark moving around the perimeter of the board and between the different spaces. And then the octopus is going to be moving through the spaces themselves. The octopus uses a bit of a hidden movement mechanism, while the shark is going to be trying to locate where that octopus is and try to take a bite out of them. I'm always interested in two-player games, and this one reminds me a lot of the game Raptor, which is one of my favorite two-player games, and it's one that I've had in my collection forever, so getting something that's like that game but offering something a little bit different is very interesting to me, and this one does look a lot prettier, although Raptor doesn't look too bad either. And the next game that I'm really interested in is Ascendancy. I just can't wait to play this game. So much so that I think I'm actually more interested in it than where it's placed right now. So I'm going to move it up a bit, and we'll come back to that one in a second. The next game I'm most interested in is Ironwood, and this one is a two-player asymmetrical game. Some people are comparing it to Root, including myself, but I much prefer this because you don't have to worry about 1,000 different asymmetrical creatures. Instead, you just have to worry about you and your opponent. What's cool about this game is that it is a 2-player area control game. And what's also cool about that is that one player is going to be moving exclusively through the mountains, and then the other player is going to be moving exclusively through the forests. Each of the players also have unique win conditions that they're trying to fulfill, and each player will be using action cards in order to perform their various actions. Since you can't occupy the same location as your opponent, you can only attack them when they're adjacent to you. That's not always your best play, but you will want to do it if you think it will help you reach your endgame condition. This one is coming from Mindclash Games that has a history of creating fantastic games, but also games that are usually quite heavy. I'm confident to say that this is the lightest game that they've released, and I'm also confident to say that they still held this one to that same high level of quality. The design and presentation on this one looks absolutely fantastic. Definitely try it out if you get a chance. That is Ironwood. And the next one here is also a 2-player game, but this one is a lot lighter than Ironwood because this one is a trick-taking game, but it also incorporates a little bit of area control. And what's interesting about this game is that you are going to be trying to control the various regions in order to gain victory points for the end of the game, but also every time you lose a trick, you're going to be flipping your wolf over to its lone wolf side, and then you're also going to be getting one of those clawed tokens. These tokens can help you in future trick-taking scenarios because they can add some additional strength to your side or have other different effects, but also each time that happens, it's going to be influencing and changing which suit is going to be acting as trump. Some more interesting concepts with this one. I'm always excited to try 2-player trick-taking games. Wolves are also the coolest animal on the planet, so that doesn't harm it either. And the next one we have is Everdell Duo, and I don't have any info on this one so far other than it's based on Everdell and it's going to be offering you a 2-player version of that game. I don't know exactly how much this is going to borrow from Everdell or if it's going to be a different game just set in the same universe. It looks like it does include a lot of the same elements, but there's just not a lot of info out on this one so far, so it looks like GenCon is going to be the place to be if you want to check this one out, and I definitely will be. Next we have Aquatica, specifically the Coral Reefs expansion, and Aquatica is a game that's been out for some time, and it's a really excellent game. Super easy to get to the table while still offering a lot of variability and depth for any gamer in your group. And this expansion just adds a couple more components into the game with the coral as well as these different tokens that you'll be able to assign to the different columns on your board. And those are going to be adding some additional effects or scoring objectives that are going to be another thing that you can try to achieve or take advantage of. There's going to be some other cards and goals that they're going to be incorporating to also riff off the new Coral Reef mechanism. And if you are a fan of Aquatica, this looks like an expansion that you'll definitely want to add. Or if you think Aquatica could use a little bit more complexity, which I personally do, I think this one is going to give it a nice little kick in that direction. Now we've made it back to Ascendancy, which is the next game that I'm most excited about, and the reason that I'm so excited about this one is that it's a worker placement game where players are going to have 4 different types of workers with each column in your own personal player board representing that worker, and you'll be able to upgrade your worker in various ways. But you're also going to have 4 different worker placement boards where you can assign your workers, and each one of those boards is going to be associated with a different phase. The catch here is that each of your workers are associated with just one of those boards and can only be used on that specific board or phase, with the caveat that each of your workers can use any of the locations of any workers to the left on your own personal player board. This means that the leftmost worker can only be used at its specific worker placement board, but the second column of workers here can also use that board as well as its own. Then the workers all the way on the right can use any of the boards. All the different action locations look really fun in the way that they work, and I think there's going to be a lot of great decisions for players to consider when they're deciding which workers they want to upgrade and which ones they want to invest into, and when they want to play their more flexible workers. This is definitely an ambitious game, but I've looked into this one in detail, and from everything that I can see, it looks like the designers really know what they're doing with this one. Of course, there's a lot more going on with it than what I've just said in this video, so if you do want to learn more, find this one at GenCon and give it a try for yourself. And we're finally breaking into the top 10 here with Spectacular, which is a competitive drafting game where players are going to be trying to build up an ecosystem, drafting different tiles, and then drafting dice to place on those tiles in order to score the most victory points at the end of the game. There's different patterns and sets that you're trying to create, and you're trying to match up different types of terrain, and you can multiply the amount of victory points that a region gets if you're able to get mating pairs there. I highly recommend checking out Rado's coverage of this game because he does a great job covering it and he goes into way more detail than what I just did. And as I was watching his video and he was explaining how the game plays, I did have one particular gripe with it, and that's that all your information is public when you're deciding which tile you want to draft. And an interesting mechanism in this game is that after each player drafts a tile or die from the board that's currently in front of them, you're then going to be passing that board to the player next to you. The problem with being able to see what everyone else is drafting is that you're going to want to wait until you see what your neighbor does before you decide what you want to draft from yours. And that is really important information if you're trying to be super competitive in this game, but it's also something that's going to be slowing the game down quite a bit because each player is going to be waiting to see what the player before them does before they decide what they do. And I was expecting there to be some sort of component that would hide your selection from the other players so that everyone can just pick simultaneously, something like one of these blinds that you would usually use in other games. But that was not the case in this game, and it actually made me laugh when Rado pointed this out at the end of his video, and he actually gave a really great solution on how to fix it. And if you want to know all of his opinions and what his solution was, definitely go check out his video, and I'll try to remember to link it in the description down below. And the next game that I'm most interested in checking out at GenCon is Epos, a Gentes game, and they do have here in their update that they will be at GenCon and where you can find them. This one looks like a really fun Euro game where players are going to be spending time in order to perform their actions, and they're also going to be building up their population in different skill types, with each of those skill types competing with another one so that you'll have to decide which of the different skill types you want to invest in more. They'll be drafting different action tokens from the main board in order to take that action, with some of them offering you more of a value than others, so you will want to get those tokens before your opponents. Players can also gain these different building cards that you can see at the top here, and as you build those out, you're going to be building out a tableau of those cards, with each of them potentially giving you some sort of special action or some sort of benefit. And in order to build those, you'll need to meet the minimum requirements of the different types of population. There's also an area out on the main board where players will be taking control of different regions of the map, and any time that you build a building in a particular region, you'll be able to activate the ability of that location as well as any other buildings that you've already built in that region. I think this one looks like a really tight Euro game, and I'll definitely be checking this one out. This next one here is a game that I already own, but this one is a standalone expansion to that game, and this is Phantom Ink Arcana. And this one essentially adds a bit of special abilities to an already amazing game. And this is a game where players are going to be broken up into two different teams, and then there's going to be one player on each team acting as the spirit. At the start of each round, those two spirits are going to be getting together and then choosing a word from a card, and that's going to be the word that they're each trying to get their team to guess first. Everyone else on their team is going to be acting as mediums who can communicate to the ghosts, but they can only communicate to them through the cards that they have in their hands. Because each of the mediums will have a hand of cards, and they'll be able to talk amongst each other and figure out which two cards they want to give to their ghost. Then the ghost is going to be choosing one of those cards in secret, and then answering the question by writing down a word, one letter at a time, until their team tells them to stop. The reason that you don't want your ghost to write down too much is because it could unintentionally give clues to the other team. But the teams are going to be going back and forth, handing two cards in secret to their ghosts and then having their ghosts write down a word until one team feels like they have enough information to try and guess what the secret word actually is. If you're ready to guess, you're going to be taking the pencil and then writing down the word that you think it is, one letter at a time. And then your ghost is going to be knocking twice on the table every time that you write a correct letter. If you don't hear a knock, you're wrong and you've just wasted one of your turns. The first team to guess the word wins the game, and I definitely recommend trying this one if you do get the chance. This is a really fun game. I hold this one high up there with code names for party games that I actually like. I'm really excited to get this edition and mix it in with my existing game just to get a little bit more variety with the different cards that you get, as well as those new special ability cards. And the next game that I'm super excited about at GenCon is Endeavor Deep Sea, and this is just a better in every single way version of the previous edition of Endeavor. The theme with this one is just way more fun, and the artwork is a lot more colorful, and it does add a few new mechanisms to boot. This is a game where players are going to be exploring the deep sea and taking different actions in different places by using their action discs. Players are going to be recruiting different specialists that are going to allow them to perform all sorts of different actions, but in order to activate them, you're going to be putting them into your tableau and then using your action disc in order to use their special ability. The issue here is that once you deploy an action disc, you have to get those discs back, and the amount of discs you get back is something that you can upgrade throughout the game, and the amount of discs that you actually have can also be increased. And like I said, some of these locations you can get your discs back after you place them, while other ones, your discs remain there permanently for the rest of the game. There's also all sorts of tracks that players can interact with to get all sorts of other bonuses. And this game's going to offer some really good decisions when you're deciding how to time your actions, and also when you're deciding what you want to invest those action tokens into. And my sixth most interested game on this list is Galactic Cruise. And this one is a worker placement game where players are going to be putting together different rocket ships and then launching them into space to send your guests to a vacation in the stars. Of course, there's going to be a bunch of different actions to facilitate all this, but the thing that really makes this game special is the way that the action locations actually work here. There's a few different worker placement locations in the center of the board, and each one of those locations is going to have two different actions to choose from. But what's really cool here is that players can actually build these gears between the worker placement locations, which essentially connects those locations for that player. This means that you can put your worker at a location, but then use an action from a location that's adjacent to you, or even 2 spaces or 3 spaces away, assuming that you have the gears to make those connections. Other players can use your gears, but it is going to come with a bonus to you if they decide to do that. There's a bunch more to love about this game, but just in the interest of being quick here, I just wanted to point out the mechanism that I think is the most interesting. If you want to learn more about this one, you can find it at GenCon. I have also covered most of these games in my past videos, and I'll try to leave a link to each of the games that I have covered in the description down below. This was one of them. And fifth on the list is Agemonia, and this one is a campaign-driven cooperative game where players are going to be playing through a campaign booklet with each of the locations having all sorts of different story points out on the map, each of them being associated to a different card that's going to be telling you a little bit of information about the story and that specific location. The reason that I'm so excited about this one is because Agemonia is a campaign game that seems to get everything right. There's not a dizzying amount of dialogue, and it's all provided to you in bite-sized chunks. And it's a game that allows you to fail forward, and it also makes good use out of the campaign booklet so that you're not spending a whole lot of time setting up or tearing down this game. The actual gameplay looks like a ton of fun as well, both incentivizing you to explore and to also be quick with your exploration, because there is a bit of a timer associated with each of the scenarios in this game that's going to be keeping you moving forward and deciding what you want to invest in and what you want to cut ties with. A lot of content for this one, so if it is one you're interested in, it's definitely one that you want to try before you buy, and GenCon is a great opportunity for that. And the next game that you can preview at GenCon is How to Save a World. And this one's an amazing Euro game that incorporates both worker placement as well as a bit of deck building and even a bit of resource management. Both your workers as well as the cards that you gain in this game can allow you to perform additional actions on your turn. And both of those aspects in the game have a lot of very interesting decisions to present to you. The goal of this game is to get the most victory points at the end of the game, but players are going to be investing in 3 different projects, with one of those stopping an incoming meteor. Well, I guess one of the projects is just to evacuate the planet, so 2 of them are to stop the meteor, and the other one is to give up on the planet and get the heck out of Dodge. This is a game that I have played and I can vouch for it. And if you're looking for a modern Euro game, I think this is probably going to be one of the best on the market. Not only is the design on this one really tight, but it also has a bit of fun with the theme and gets into territory that a lot of other Euro games just tend to stay away from. I mean, there's nothing wrong with building farms or building out cities, but every now and again, you gotta have a Euro game that's about total annihilation. And my number 3 game that you can check out at GenCon is Trio, except for more specifically, I would recommend Nana, because these are the exact same game, except for Nana, I believe, is the original, and it also has way better artwork, and if you ever buy Trio and then realize this one exists, it's going to make you question where we went wrong as a society. But Nana or Trio is essentially a game of Go Fish if Go Fish had an element of deduction, bluffing, and actually a bit of strategy. All the players are going to have a hand of cards, and they have to be ordered from smallest to largest, and whenever you're asking for another player to reveal one of their cards, you can only tell them to reveal their lowest or their largest. But there's also going to be some cards face down in the center of the table that you can also choose to reveal. As long as the cards you reveal are matching, you can continue on with your turn, and once you get enough, you're going to be completing that set of cards. You'll be able to secure that set as your own because the goal of this game is to be the first to reach a certain amount of sets. I realize this game might not sound like that much fun, and it might just sound like a simple memory game, but this is definitely one that you need to play in order to appreciate its genius. It's super rewarding when you deduce correctly and get the cards that you're looking for, but it's also going to have a ton of laughs and face palms when players select the wrong cards, when the card that they were looking for was already revealed moments ago, and they're the only one at the table that forgot. And my number 2 game that you can check out at GenCon is another smaller one, and this one is called Landmarks. And the reason that I'm so excited about this one is because this game looks like it's going to be able to hold its own against games like Codenames. I don't think this one is going to replace Codenames or anything like that, but I do think it's going to punch in the same weight class. And I think this is a game that would pair well with games like Codenames, so after you've played your 4th game of Codenames in a row, you have something a little bit different to pull out on the table. This is a game that you can play cooperatively or competitively, and just like Codenames, there's certain locations that you want the players to move to, and certain locations that you want them to avoid. All this information is going to be outlined on a card that only the player giving the clues is going to be able to know. And then they're going to be writing single words on tiles and putting them out on the board, making connections between the various tiles already out on the board in order to help indicate a path of where they want the other players to move. So I think you can see some similarities to Codenames, but still see how this game plays very, very different from it. Codenames is one of my favorite games of all time for good reason, and it's definitely my most played game of all time. So finding another game here that I could consider even substituting for it, I think is really impressive, and that's why this one is my number 2 in the list. And my number 1 on the list is Ada's Dream, and this is a Euro game that I did not think I was going to be interested in at all when I first heard about it. But the more I looked into this one, the more excited I was about what this game had to offer. First of all, this game has a combination of very unique mechanisms. It uses a rondel dice drafting mechanism where players are going to be drafting dice from this little circle in the middle of the board. But anytime you do that, you're going to be moving a die from one space to another. And also the value and the color, and if there's any dice there in the same circle, are going to have different implications on other aspects of the game. You'll essentially be using that die later in the game to take actions based on its color or its value. The players in this game are each trying to invent the first computer, and each player is going to have their own computer board. And what's really neat about this board is that as you're collecting those dice, you'll be able to find different actions that allow you to place those dice onto the board. There's other actions that allow you to gain different kinds of gears, and then you'll be able to place those in the spaces between the dice. And the reason that this is important is because each of the columns and rows are going to be scoring at the end of the game, and the way that each of those score is by completing the mathematical function that you've created between the gears and the dice. This is a really fun thematic tie-in, using your computer board to give you victory points through the use of mathematics. I shouldn't be this excited about math. Another really cool aspect of this board is that you'll be able to acquire these different punch cards which can modify the function in different ways. And you'll be able to slot these into any of the rows or columns in order to take advantage of their effects. Of course, there is a lot more to this one, and I have covered this one in detail along with many other games that I've just mentioned in this list. So if you are interested to check out any of these games in a lot more detail, I will list the games that I have covered previously with their associated video in the description down below. I hope this list helped you find some games that maybe slipped under your radar until now. Just like I mentioned before, if you do catch me at GenCon, feel free to stop me and say hello. It's always nice meeting everyone from the community. I do find it pretty fun. But that's all I got for this episode. Thanks so much for tuning in, and until next time, keep that shelf cluttered and the table full.